Thank you very much for being here. I would like to thank, in particular, Fausto Bertinotti and his wife, Lella, who's here in the first row, because to be here to show us their friendship, the friendship for the meeting, they traveled. They had a biblical exodus by car from where they were having a holiday, spending a holiday. It's really a great sign of friendship, and I would like to start by thanking them for agreeing to attend here. To Fausto and Lella, his wife. I would say more to Lella. I was driving. She was more at risk, really. And she did say something about your driving style, but that's for somewhere else to discuss. So I would like to introduce this conversation, if you like, say something about its format. The title is a summary of the meeting, the future of the meeting's title, the future of tradition. And our intent was to make sure that this could be a dialogue, not so much a lecture. So we organized it, as is happening more and more during the meeting. Our idea is that it's interesting to see how tradition communicates with young people. We have a group of people from students from university. They've also been in contact with Mr. Bertinotti after public meetings on various occasions. So the idea of this session during today's meeting is to invite to the podium some of these students. They have sort of selected some of the focal points about the issues of tradition, future, heritage, prospects. So we chose 4 of them: Davide, Eduardo, Andrea, and Bernardo. They'll be helping us later on this morning, and we'll start this conversation together. Just to start off this meeting this morning, I would like to start by referring to the topic is what has been handed over to us, passed on to us, tradition and future. And to introduce this, I recently read the latest book, I think, by Massimo Recalcati. He's a psychoanalyst, journalist, essayist, called The Secret of the Child, the Son. And the relationship with tradition and future is the archetype of the father-son relationship, the father-child relationship, and that is also the issue of tradition. The tradition we were born in and the traditions we represent. Fausto's tradition is well known. We all know it. He has been a protagonist, a key player in the workers' fights, trade unions, issues, the left-wing political tradition, and all that is related to it. So the basic question, according to Recalcati, is the father-son relationship. It's like 2 models, 2 points of view, 2 narrations. First of all, you have the Oedipal perspective, Oedipus and Laius, the tragedy In the model of Oedipus, the only possible relationship between father and son is for the son to kill the father. The very birth of the son marks the decline of the father. The father wants to kill the son. The relationship between generations is totally symmetrical. One wants the exact opposite as the other. And what is the fate, the destiny of this approach? Each generation is destined, as it were, to killing the previous generation. The other model or pattern used in the book about the father-son relationship is what we call the prodigal son parable. But prodigal has its own implications. So it's like, it's a parable, okay, in Luke's gospel. A relationship between father and son is very different here. The son asks the father for the inheritance, according to the tribal tradition of those days. In Luke's gospel, asking for the inheritance in those social structural, asking for half the assets was a very serious violation of the rules and contents. But the father agreed to leaving the inheritance to be used by the son, and even wasted away. And then the prodigal son returns, meets the father again. And what struck me is that when the son meets the father in Luke's gospel, the father, even before the son says anything, hugs him. The son had already devised a strategy. I'm going to tell him this and that. I'm going to work for him in the lowliest position, even with the lowliest salary. But then an attempt is made to find a symmetry. But here we find the asymmetry in Luke's gospel. The father has this unheard of gesture. The son is different from the father, but it's sort of included within the father. So it's an analogy used by Massimo Recalcati, which I think is also applicable today, in trying to explain the ideas, the patterns, the ways we have of living a tradition we are part of, a tradition which can be destroyed, brought down, or embraced again, over and over again. What is your position, Fausto, about the future of tradition? Well, thank you, Andrea, and thanks to all the audience for being here again. Well, you will see from my answer that I'm in trouble already at the outset. I would like to start by referring to what Andrea said, the myth and the parable, because I think they are very enlightening in terms of our condition. And to be very frank, the myth is our current condition. Our current condition as inhabitants, citizens of this world, where it seems that the relationship between father and son can only involve the son killing the father. That is to say, getting rid of, eliminating tradition. The myth of the future, which does not take into account tradition, and therefore proves to be a source of concern and worry because it is dehumanized. It is a future that breaks away with tradition in the sense that we are presented with a world where human beings are totally subjugated by what we call innovation, modernization, if you want to put it this way, the world of machinery and goods and equipment, so we don't need the past. That's what killing the father means. It means that we refuse being subject to its surveillance, if you like. We want to move towards a future where we will be stranded, shipwrecked. We are going towards something carried by the events, and we have to make do. We have to adapt. And in order to do this, we need to do it with tradition, because it's too much. So this leads us back to Oedipus. On the other hand, we have the prodigal son, which expresses something that is not there, and we would actually need the event, the possibility, the possible world, something which is not actually before us yet. In my tradition, you could call it the dream. In our tradition, it is hope. Hope, not as something inert or sickeningly sweet, something we don't like. Blocks hope, the investment in the future, in another possible world. So it's this extraordinary condition of freedom where the father, this is an idea that comes from Father Caron, even before hugging the son, lets him go. Even though the father knows he'll be making mistakes, he lets him go his own way, even though he knows it's the wrong path, trusting that the freedom gained from experience will allow the son to understand the mistakes. And so the father embraces the son, even before listening to what he has to say, because he's already sure that something has been accomplished. So this world is something we don't have. What do we have, though? We have the history of us, if you like, our history, which we are destroying, unfortunately. It's what has been referred to as the loss of evidence. So what was my tradition, for example? For us, was the workers' movement. It is something that allowed us not to follow in the tracks of Oedipus. It made it possible for fathers not to be felt as adversaries or a burden to be removed. As long as this history was there with its dream and hope, the hope of making the world a better place, the search for the other as your need, not as a limitation, the attempt to free society, the father, even in spite of the tragedies of history in the past century, belonged to us, because continuity with tradition was your mission, your task. That's our us. The possibility of getting rid of the Oedipal dimension and approaching the parable of the prodigal son. This us was so strong that it entailed sacrificing freedom, the freedom of the individual. It was something that even required the sacrifice of the person to make the world a better place. So, but that story ends not with that awareness, but you have the Oedipus complex, the idea that you need to do away with tradition. You need to put it aside, if you like. With the October Revolution in Russia and communism, that was, of course, set off a series of dramatic events, it's something that basically led to forgetting. We have an exhibition here at the meeting by Comunione e Liberazione about the October Revolution, organized actually by Comunione and Liberazione. And there will be a reason for this there, of course. The reason is that in your history, tradition is there, is very much alive. On the other hand, we have got rid of it, disposed of it. But this has not led us to gaining innocence. We have refused memory, condemned memory, and we have not critically reviewed the past. It's just a passage to the other side. Here, it's not only a betrayal of clerics, it's the loss of us. In this intention to escape history and tradition, we have fallen into the trap of Oedipus, the need to kill the father to move towards the future. That's a trap, because you deprive yourself of tradition, and so you still have to come to grips with the future. You run the risk of being subjected to the future, and you need to kill the father. We hope that the parable of the prodigal son will help us find a way where we can deal with such a dramatic tradition and innovate history, as opposed to erasing history and the personal experiences that have helped build this history. I don't want to cut in on the applause. It's just to keep the flow and use the best, make the best use of time. Davide has a question.
Avevi una questione, mi pare, proprio su questo tema.
Buongiorno, Presidente.
Good morning, Mr. President. According to what you have just said, and following what you said during other meetings, I wanted to get into this topic because you said the I cannot survive without a contextual us. And this is fundamental for the individual and the construction of society, because just together we can come to terms with the sort of desertification that we are witnessing. But there are some excesses. A too prominent I, which is selfish, and on the other, a too fragile spirit of association, and an us that suffocates the I, as it happened in Paris during the Commune, where the partisans somehow disappeared within the newborn state. So what shall we do to avoid that the I is erased? And the following question is, what kind of us can we get from this tradition? Thank you. Thank you for your question. The us that is bequeathed by the tradition is something that I have just mentioned. It's something which is exalting at the same time and oppressing. And it is something that my tradition has strongly affirmed. It was a tangible possibility, an opportunity. I don't know if we can talk about real communism or a workers' movement that were somehow similar with other experiences of the left-wing policies. It's something that makes the individual as something that is just modeled by the us. It's like not recognizing the individual. That's where the limitation of freedom comes from. It comes from the idea that there is a cause for which we can and we must alienate, forget your and our requests, our needs. The cause is the idea that you are somehow liberating a strength to make the other people free from the conditions of misery, of poverty that they had. And after a very good period in which all the people were the protagonists and they were vital and important, at some point the cause became the most important thing and required people to be loyal and not to participate, to take part in it. This resulted in extraordinarily human experiences where people started to be alive again. But the trend was exactly that one. So if we think of risk, today the world is, especially in the Western countries, characterized by the deistification of us and the prominence of the I. So the individual is at the forefront, and the victim and the murderer of the society in which we live are embodied by the I. And the individual just becomes the image of success, of being successful, but forgetting the other. And step by step, this individual does not realize that there will be another individual that will somehow eat him, that will destroy him, something that will accompany this person. Individualization was something seen to be a real individual, and it's somehow connected to what is called liberalism. But there is an even more worrying thing behind it, that is the domination of the machine, of science, where this individual is just as an engine, as a gear, and the us is just functional to this dramatic and catastrophic words that we have in front of us. And what's the opposite reaction? The reaction is fundamentalism. This situation, stemming from alienation, consumption, and machinery, and the world of machinery, it produces fanatism, where there is a sort of new nihilism, which is seen as the only possible way. Isn't terrorism resulting from this condition? Isn't it coming from a community that is becoming so totalizing that requires you to sacrifice your life in order to go against an enemy. But this happens because the us disappears is neither the community nor the individual. It is outside. It is a process to construct the people. Otherwise, the people are destroyed, are into pieces, and the individuals are alone on the market and with the goods that they need to buy in the world of consumption. And on the other hand, there is a sort of closeness with an enemy that is trying to be defeated with any type of weapons. But the construction of the idea and the concept of people is the only possible way. Thank you, Davide. And I think that you mentioned a very interesting and thorny aspect at the same time. This relationship between the I and the us, the construction of a people. What can construct people, avoiding a mere construction of the I? And what can create an individual that is able to have a relationship with the past that somehow laid the basis for that community to be created? So in our tradition, in the tradition of our education, Father Giussani identified this ability of relationship in a phenomenon. It was the ability of relationship between the past and the education. So the topic of education is something that can construct people and the awareness of people. And Giussani said something about the main points that are at the basis of the educational process. And I would like to ask your opinion about this. He said that what we need to say about education in the book called Il rischio educativo, the educational risk, he said we are interested in 3 points. In order to educate, we need to tell the past in the adequate way. Without knowing the past and the tradition, young people would become too skeptical. If it's not possible to have hypotheses or alternatives to work, the young person would create some new, but would become skeptical and would not be consistent with that hypothesis. And there's a tradition that looks at reality in a total way. Second point, the past can be given to young people provided that it is lived in the present experience that tells the reasons why there was this past. And this gives us the right and the duty to talk about the tradition. Third point is that the real education should be something critical. Because the child, the 10-year-old child can say, Mom said this or the teacher said this, because the child is remembering and is memorizing the good things that he or she has been told. However, there are other things that are put in front of his or her eyes. And so we need to propose the past in an adequate way, but in a present context and with a critical approach. What do you think about this? Can this be the way in which the I and the us are generated, are constructed? Well, I think so, but with one condition. I would try to somehow amplify this thought by Father Giussani. trying to make the second point an absolute point. The first and the third cannot exist without the second. We can work hard on this, we can do whatever we can, but we will never be able, you will never be able to show tradition according to what Father Giussano described. So to the second point that he mentioned. And the critical approach is meaningless without the second, because the second point talks about us. It makes us all responsible, all together. The second point asks us, what shall we do? In this world where, for example, Rome at Piazza Indipendenza, the refugees have been sent away using violence, but they had been there for 5, 6 years now, and we are happy that the migration flows stopped. We don't care if these people are dying in sort of lagers. So the crucial question is, what shall we do? What do we do in order to be critical towards the present? Walter Benjamin is an author that I very often remember, and that said something similar to what Father Giussani said, and it takes into consideration the us and the tradition in a very enlightened way. The term is remembering, and making live in the present the tradition and those people that in the history of humanity and mankind tried to build an us that is free and able to have important human relationships, that is able to give a meaning to the life of human beings. So it's what you are trying to do here, trying to recover their ambition, not only and not really their tangible history, but their ambition, their hope, their dream that made them be the protagonists of their era, be them slaves, be them in the revolutions in Paris, be them the people at the basis of new kinds of ideas and movements. So remembering is making that ambition live again here. And in my tradition, that word is called equality. Make equality live and be lived. In our word is the only possible opportunity to talk about tradition in the proper way. Otherwise, it just remains a tale or a trick. Look at what happens in Europe now. Why isn't there any more or a critical thought? Why that? Or why is it very weak? Because being now aside from tradition and not letting that tradition live in the present, we do not have that critical ability anymore. Walter Benjamin also talked about another image about the leap of a tiger. How should we look at the future to face it? This future that is abstract, that is somehow fallen away. How can you grab it? How can you become the real protagonist of the future? He said, we should take the same leap as a tiger, because the tiger, to get the prey, needs to take a step backward in order to have the strength to take a giant leap forward. And that's what you should do. And that somehow goes hand in hand with what Father Giussani said, making the tradition live in the present. And this is what we all should remember in this very difficult present.
Vieni Edoardo. E mi viene
Commemoration or remembering has the same root as memory, which in our tradition expresses something very similar to what you suggested. Now the floor to Edoardo. You already answered my question in part. Reliving tradition also helps build an identity, this remembering. In an interview, you underlined that in today's left, we seem to have no critical grid. It's something I noticed too. I am a student's representative at university, and it's as if we had many points that are considered steps in a path which in what we consider the right direction, but we can't find a unifying element. So that's the issue of identity, the issue of tradition. What is tradition today? You've been talking a lot about the need for dialogue between your tradition and the most lively forces in society, Catholics, for example. So what is the identity we can regain? Do you have a clear identity for dialogue, or is identity something you need to build as you go along through dialogue? Thank you, Edoardo. Well, I think we could try and combine the two words you mentioned. Rebuilding, starting from or using as leverage and building in dialogue, working together. I think that the two things are necessary. You can't work together unless you have a goal. Finding a goal is the issue underlying faith, of course. The idea of knowing where you're going, your direction, your goal. This huge topic, which the workers' movement believed it had solved through socialism, the rejection of capitalism, a new society, and walking together with others, even though the history has been controversial and denied by the parties at times, but working together. The point I would like to make is that today this task is necessary in order to save humanity from a catastrophic risk which is intrinsic to our history. This catastrophic risk can take several shapes, the violence of war and physical destruction, or it may take the shape, a more less tragic shape of human beings becoming things, humanity becoming like objects, the loss of awareness in the I and the us, and reducing humans to things, thus creating a sort of competition. These two scenarios are present today. What Pope Francis referred to as World War III. And he's analyzed this on several occasions in a very well-founded way, even if policymakers don't seem to hear this. On the other hand, you have the less visible penetration within us of technologies and incorporated sciences. It's as if we were becoming a prosthesis of machinery. There's a fascinating character in history, Marcos. When he talked about guerrillas, he said you should not wear too long a weapon, bear a weapon for too long, because in the long run you will become a weapon yourself, an extension of the weapon. It will no longer be the weapon as an extension of your body. This is also true for technology. Technology is machinery, equipment. If you wear it too long, starting from smartphones or cell phones, you become a sort of attachment to the machine. So we are at risk. Humanity is at risk. Building an identity has to do with both elements. I would say building values or principles, even though this is ambiguous, and on the other side, working together in order to make a community, establish relationships, being more human. So building a people is our task. Building peoples. Our safety will not be in institutions, be it the government or political parties or social partners. Our safety is in constructing, building a people. That is to say, bringing together here and now associations, groups. That's what building humanity means. In my tradition, this is called equality. If you ask me, what does it mean to work together, restoring tradition, the answer, according to my tradition, will be starting again from equality. This is not only part of my tradition, but of yours too. No need for me to remind you of the famous words by St. Paul in his letter to Galatians. I am in the Lord, the same in the Gentiles. In this sense, our traditions related to faith move on from this enlightening principle, the principle of equality. In order to build equality, we need a people. And this is, I think, what it means to create an open identity, to create an identity in favor of someone, not against someone. In my tradition, there is also something we should eliminate, the idea of working against someone, against an enemy. No, we need to build humanity together for someone, for humanity. Yes, I just try and chip in for a moment. You mentioned these words, equality. In history, what creates equality? Because there is a version of this at the heart of people's experience, which says that to have equality we need a law. Outside the law there is no equality. Outside the state there is no equality. Outside the institutions you mentioned there's no equality. So what is the relationship between the word equality and the word dignity? Equality, I understand, in tradition, and how is this related? We see that we're all different at first glance, but this founding value of our being equal, what does it rest upon? There is a tradition saying without a government, without a state, we are bound to fall prey to nature, which makes us different. But you said we need something outside us. So I said, could it be dignity? as a concept? Well, the idea of equality being a sort of promise is associated with a multitude of relationships, and often even those who support equality forgot these relationships. They tended to think that they were sort of something all-encompassing, totalizing. In this way, it's evident that we're all different. Of course, this needs to be seen within the concept of history, the framework of history. If you are part of the smallest, you are sort of trapped, you are constricted, and you are prevented from leaving or progressing. There are a lot of impediments in this regard described in history. For example, Father Milani's book, Letters to a Teacher, he describes that sometimes the least, the smallest, are closed, are entrapped. And this has been the cause of the all-encompassing view of equality. Why can't the smallest become the greatest soon? We need just to think of the Anabaptists and this idea that there have been plenty of religious, political forms, the immediacy of making something happen at all costs, even through violence. But history needs to be understood, but not defended and projected forward, if you like, because this is a concept that prevents equality from becoming experience. Search for a life in common. The last concept, the last form, expression of this totalizing view was the primacy of the law and of the government, of the state. The final form with which equality has become aware that it could express itself at all costs was building a government, a state. Since we are not able in social relations, in human relations, in establishing communities to be equal, we call upon a higher entity, the state, the law, with which we implement it from above. But there is a contradiction between these two, equality and having something implemented from the top down, because this element leads to inequality between those who are in some way controlled and those who control. In socialist societies, inequality was produced in the area of power. Inequality was eliminated in the area of position, but became absolute in the area of power. You had someone who had absolute power and those who could only obey. So we learned that the final attempt to build equality forcibly did not work. Equality is a goal, but it's also a practice. So in my historical tradition, the most important lesson is not the elections, voting, government, but it's where people meet, trade unions, associations, cooperatives, that is to say, building relationships together. What is left of that great history is this. It is building communities. Very often I am asked, what are you interested in Comunione e Liberazione? Well, what I'm interested in most is how a people is created, more than your ability to attract this or that, the many interesting and smart things from which I learn. But what I really am attracted to and I find most promising is being a people. And this reminds me of the best part of my tradition, the strikes, the trade unions, organizations. Thank you. Now the floor to Andrea. Good morning. The question I wanted to ask you was already partly in your answer. Anyway, talking about this meeting's title this year, what is my inheritance from my father? And when we talk about, I talk about with my father, who was at university in the 70s, when there were great political ideals to fight for, I realized that what he mentions to me is a world that is far away from mine, so distant from mine. It's also a different way of living from the way we live now as university students nowadays. It is as if your generation lived through something which cannot be passed on to my generation. So my question was, what is left for you as heritage, and how is it passed on? Is it part of a world that no longer exists? Thank you. It's a very difficult, demanding question. First of all, because our father's heritage, when time allows for this, is an open legacy, if you like, which you can accept or not. It's like in the prodigal son parable. The father has a legacy. What is the legacy or the inheritance? It's freedom. The father does not expect to tell the son, do the same things I did, do what I would like you to do. No, he says, go your own way. There is a legacy, a promising legacy from the fathers, which means encouraging your curiosity, your life, and your path. But in order for this to happen, we need fathers. So the issue is, the point is that your generation has no fathers. I hope I'm not offending anyone. It's just to say that fathers have disappeared with their histories. I'm, of course, talking about civilian history, not personal story. I'm talking about history with a capital H. I'm talking about the relationship between generations. The generation of the fathers has disappeared, and it has disappeared because the world we belong to, and I'm sorry, very sorry to say this, is no longer there. We are children, I am a child of the 20th century, and that century has been buried by historical defeat, and at the same time there has been a revolution which was outside history, the revolution of modern-day capitalism, financial capitalism, the 5, 6, or 7 people who hold all the wealth of whole populations. So, as far as I'm concerned, there's been a dramatic defeat. We are like the Maya. How can we pass something on? There's been a total breakup. So the history of the 20th century has been totally destroyed, like the Egyptians and the Maya. There's a lot to find, but it's something for archaeologists, not for modern-day people. So fathers need to walk with young generations, with you, to find history, because the legacy of the past is something that requires walking together, learning from others, learning as you go along. That's the only thing I feel I have to say. The only thing I feel I have to say, or I can't say, is that the Mayas, the Egyptians, the workers' movements did know something. Men and women need to be put in a condition to show their dignity as individuals. So you need to fight for and conquer equality. Finally, we have a question from Bernardo.
Osservando la dialettica.
Good morning. So, looking at the politics in our country today, sorry, if you talk about politics, I can leave, I can go out. Sometimes it seems that in order to have an identity, the needed condition, the required condition, is to have strong ideals and pursue them. Whereas there are few people that are committed to deal with difficulty period we are going through. Listening to what you said in the course of years and now, I realize that for you it is very important to question what we think without standing in the same position, in the same stance. So one's positions, one's opinion can change. And what is, in your opinion, the most important factor in your growth, be it personal or political, and something that characterized all of your life up to now? And second question, what made it possible for you that you continued searching, looking for it? Thank you for your question. First, I would like to say that, in my opinion, having strong ideas and questioning them, it's not a contradiction. If we have strong ideas and we critically think about them, even to change them, it's difficult, but it's something possible. And if the two things are separated, in my opinion, that's a disaster. Because not having strong ideas or not change ideas would be a disaster. And I think that in this part of the world, the main problem is not changing the ideas, whereas in other parts of the world, for sure, there are two strong ideas. Well, I think that weak ideas, as we have somehow, produce weak people and weak conditions. So we should have strong ideas and question them on the basis of our experience. But you asked, and I thank you very much for what you said about my experience. You asked me what allowed me to do this, to have this experience. Maybe I'm repeating myself, but it's just the awareness of belonging to this people. After several defeats, I can say that I'm not an expert in several things, but I'm an expert in defeat. I can tell you that. And failures also. You asked me what allowed me to start over again. It's how your people, the people you belong to, looked at me. The look of that woman, of that man, of that worker, of that elder person that somehow is telling me, okay, let's try again. When at the beginning I worked in the trade unions, I was in Bologna for my first congress with CGIL, and there was Fernando Sanzio, a very renowned man coming from this area, a very strong man with very strong principles and ideals. And when he left, with the closing speech, the closing remark, he said, okay, I'm going to say goodbye, but remember, I'm a man with great ambitions. And my ambition is, for example, that tomorrow, when I'm not here anymore, a farmer from Puglia or a worker from Lombardy can say, that person, Fernando, was one of our people. And that's the ambition that allows you to start over again. So we are getting not really to the conclusion, because I think that this dialogue should continue, should go on not only now, but also in the future. But at some point we will have to stop it. And we are all lucky to be here and to have the chance of having this dialogue despite having not so much time. Several things you said, your remarks, helped us understand, in my opinion, this great mystery that is how useful it could be to go along one's way together with somebody else, despite being different, because one person can better understand the other, can better know the other. And several things you said today helped me understanding more thoroughly my tradition. And I also had the chance to understand better the tradition you come from. So I just wanted to ask you this to conclude. You mentioned, maybe you were not aware about it, you mentioned archaeology, and you didn't know that, at least I think you didn't know, that in the first row here, there are two world-renowned archaeologists, and Giorgio and Marilyn Buccellati. Because actually you mentioned this passage, this idea, which is very important to their works as well. Sometimes we do not think about it, but it's like forgetting that traditions can stop, can be interrupted. There are interrupted traditions. You mentioned Maya, the Egyptians, but we may even think to other civilizations. There were civilizations and traditions that at some point stopped, at some point in history. And living inside this, well, this topic, challenging history, and there is the chance also that our tradition will be interrupted one day. And actually, we could say we are all on the same boat with our day-by-day experience. And I always remember a sentence by the poet Montale that said, "Only an unforeseen event will be able to save us." So even the fact of meeting someone, everything was born in Carle, where you were invited to the presentation of a book by Father Giussani. Some friends told me Bertinotti was invited for this event, and I couldn't believe it. When I saw you the first time, and I met you the first time, and we started this conversation that has been ongoing from that moment on, and there were other people, famous people involved, maybe at that time I couldn't think that such a dialogue could be recovered. It was something unforeseen. And the relationship between what happens in history, the unforeseen event, and the hope, what you said before, the hope of having a relationship such as the prodigal son, to recover the relationship with the father. What's the relationship? What can be at the basis of this starting anew? Because according to Montale, it is the unforeseen event. Montale said this, and it's quite clear. And talking about our relationship and our first meeting, it was completely unforeseen, even for me, but totally unpredictable. And when I'm worried, I say the same thing that Montale said. But actually, I don't really believe in it, because I think that there is something that should go hand in hand with the unforeseen event, and it's preparation. I think you know what I mean, because there is somehow waiting for the unforeseen event in two ways. And one of this way is not just waiting, but somehow being involved in it. And there would be some specific cases in history where this was true, but let's not mention it. Isaiah and the question to the sentinel, at what point are we in the night? Well, there was a point there, and it was the idea of preparation. Sentinel, at what point is the night? And the answer we can give has lots to do with waiting for the unforeseen event. First of all, if we say it is night, it means that evidence has disappeared. We lost evidence. Don Giussani, Father Giussani, said this during an interview. And he was asked, what does that mean, that the evidence was lost? He said that it was lost in the world, not only spiritually. Evidence was social justice, human dignity, freedom for some time. This evidence today is something that we are deprived of. So sentinel, at one point is the night. The sentinel says we are at night and doesn't say we are getting to dawn. But this is connected to another issue and another topic connected to the question by Thomas Eliot. Is church that abandoned humanity, or is it humanity that abandoned church? We may even say, is it politics that abandoned the people, or the people that abandoned politics? We may say that the two are true. For sure, the politics abandoned the people, and the people have fallen into pieces. So, at night, in order to wait in a responsible and active way, what shall we do? I found an extraordinary answer in a text by Dossetti, reflecting on this question asked to the sentinel, and he used a word that I cannot repeat here, as I told to our friends that asked those very stimulating and very clever questions before. And I told them I cannot say that word because it may be understood in the wrong way. But I can paraphrase it and say we should go back to the root. So it's looking for other things, but going back to the root of human being. We should investigate the root and the idea of faith and faiths of the meaning of human being in accordance to a destination, a purpose that we need to have. However, this type of waiting in a responsible way is not enough. We should take into account the unforeseen event, because it tells us something similar to what Pope Francis has recently said, talking about an analysis of the economic and social model that we have now, and going towards the idea of a catastrophe. I don't want to say that the Pope had some nihilism in his saying, but actually he said that we should go back and take the distance from what is inside human being. The unforeseen event is what arrives and that you could not predict. And if you are prepared, the unforeseen event can be good also for freedom of humanity and mankind, instead of resulting in the opposite situation. And I strongly believe in this. So let's somehow count on the unforeseen event, and let's get prepared for those who are so ambitious to say they are still communist in this area. I think that the unforeseen event is something completely unthinkable. Thank you.
Grazie davvero tanto.
Grazie mille.
Grazie a voi. Grazie tantissimo. Grazie.
Thank you very much to every one of you. Thank you.
Grazie, grazie. Siete molto
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. This applause is, of course, an expression of our feeling. I just wanted to go back to something which might sound a bit surprising in the relationship between the unpredictable, the unforeseen, and waiting. We are here because of this unpredictable something. Even if just 10, 15 years ago we had thought about this, we couldn't have envisaged what happened today. This idea of being ready and willing, that's the point that is important in what is becoming a process, more interested, as Pope Francis said, in time and duration than in space. This process requires being prepared, requires waiting. The meeting is unpredictable. The idea of having something that is similar to what we have, the Festa dell'Unità, but it's something that we all build together. I don't know if it's clear what I'm driving at. It's true. Waiting actively for something is what the meeting relies and gives us the possibility for this kind of conversations, discussions. So we no longer have the political mechanisms behind it. The meeting exists because we all contribute. You have these corners where you can say, give now. You can make a fundraising donation. And we do this in the spirit that guides us, not generically asking for money for expenses. These red corners tell you a history, the work on the Duomo di Milano, the work on the Basilica in Bethlehem. So exactly because the people, the community needs help, I would like to thank again Lella and Fausto Bertinotti for this excellent opportunity and invite you all to continue your visit to the meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.